Livia was the second wife of Octavian. They lived together happily for over 50 years. Livia already had a husband, a very fine gentleman by the name of Tiberius Nero, when Octavian had first laid eyes on her and determined to marry her. Marriage not being looked upon as a sacred bond, but merely an arrangement to be made convenient and pleasing to all parties concerned, no difficulty was encountered, seeing that the desire of his young wife coincided with that of her admirer. Tiberius Nero obligingly gave her a divorce, and the new nuptials were celebrated. Her 2 sons were to stay with their father until his death. Drusus was a mere infant. Tiberius, a sandy-haired boy of 4, was later to be adopted by his stepfather and eventually became the second emperor of Rome. The Siege of Jerusalem. In the spring of 37 B.C., Herod's long siege of Jerusalem began. In the dusty heat of midsummer, it was far underway. Herod's forces and the Roman legions had cut off all supplies, encircled the city, and, encamped in the surrounding valleys, were waiting for it to surrender. Battering rams were pounding at its ancient walls. In that same dusty valley, almost 1,000 years before, David, the warrior king, had stood gazing up at that rocky fortress, then the last unconquered stronghold in the land of Canaan. From the top of the thick walls, the native Canaanites had looked scornfully down at the Jewish army and mocked at them. But David's men had scaled the heights, slaughtered the defenders, and taken for their own the primitive city of crude huts. Thus old Jebus Salam of the Canaanites had become the city of David. Thereafter, for almost 500 years, until the tragic exile into Babylon, descendants of David had ruled in Jerusalem and had cherished the memory of the great chief or king who had first united the 12 wandering tribes as a nation. When the exiles returned from Babylon, expecting a new king or Messiah, they believed, according to the prophet Isaiah, that he too would be of David's line. Another 500 years had passed, and while the Jews still kept looking for that promised king, for the past 100 years the Maccabeans, descendants of another hero, had served as high priest or king. So although this Maccabean who now held the city was not of David's line, though he had savagely mutilated his uncle and stolen from him the office of high priest, though he had called in the Parthians and caused all manner of bloodshed, still the people of Jerusalem were supporting him. Whatever he had done, he was a Maccabean and not a foreigner. He was one of their own tribe. Month after month they held out, while the priest kept offering sacrifices and praying to the God of hosts that he would strike down the enemy that was pounding on their gates. Outside, while the Roman soldiers, greedy for plunder, grumbled at their stubbornness, Herod marveled that the people could hold out so long, for he knew they must be starving, since this had been a Sabbath year. According to a custom that seemed most peculiar to the Romans, the Jews divided their days and also their years into 7s. As every Sabbath or 7th day was a day of rest, so too every 7th year was one of rest. On a Sabbath year, such as this one, the fields lay idle, no crops could be raised. So there had been no grain for harvesting or storage. But though faced with starvation, the people held out bravely until finally the city had to be taken by storm. As the lower city was forced open, the inhabitants fled to the upper city. As the outer court of the temple was captured, they crowded into the inner court. Still, amid the clamor and bombardment, the priest kept praying and offering up sacrifice. Every day, Herod could see the twisting column of smoke from the altar of burnt offering rising above the walls, and the air was heavy with the odor of burnt flesh. Knowing that they would blame him if they ran short of animals to sacrifice, he allowed more to be hoisted over to them, hoping to lessen their distrust by this friendly act. But with the very smoke from the offerings he had furnished rose more hate-filled prayers for his destruction. All the catapults were then thrown into action. Boulders were sent crashing down upon the temple roof. Walls were breached, gates broken open. Roman soldiers and Herod's men rushed in, crowded the steep, narrow streets of the upper city, fighting hand to hand with the defenders. Enraged to have been held off so long, thirsty for revenge, the Romans murdered, robbed, and plundered, splashing in the blood. Herod cried aloud, tore his hair, and protested. This was no way for a king to enter his capital city. But they were beyond control. By way of this bloody siege, Herod entered the city of David to be king of Judea for over 30 years. The siege had lasted 5 long months. It was now autumn. And autumn, for the Jews, was the end of one year and the beginning of the new year. On their calendar, it was the year 3723 from the creation of the world. The priests were preparing for the great New Year festival of Rosh Hashanah. It would be followed by the most solemn fast day of the year, the Fast of the Atonement, one for which crowds of pious worshippers from all over Palestine would gather in Jerusalem. From the windows of the Maccabean palace looking east, Herod could see the temple, whose courts were still heaped with rubbish from the siege. Standing beside the new king in the palace window, as 6 years ago she had stood with her small brother watching the winter sunset, was his bride and queen, the lovely Mariamne. More lovely did she seem to Herod, more tantalizing in her fragrant beauty than a rose, more irresistible, more precious than any possession he had ever owned, and more necessary, for now he, Herod, might have sons of royal Maccabean blood, and they would be safe on this throne which he had been obliged to seize with bloody hands. Or would they be safe? Could they, any more than he, be safe, so long as other Maccabean princes lived to covet the throne and gain a following among the people? And were there not always daggers, poison, and jealous enemies to guard against? Intently and suddenly, with a quiver of fear, he searched the proud though lovely face of this Maccabean princess. Feeling his eyes upon her, Mariamne turned, smiled, half opened her lips to speak. Then she closed them again and continued to stand quietly, watching the endless column of smoke rising from the altar and trailing up into the autumn sky.